This presentation will be on human trafficking. Human trafficking. Human trafficking is a form of modern-day slavery in which traffickers use the force, fraud, or coercion to control victims for the purpose of engaging in commercial sex acts or labor services against his or her own will. Human trafficking affects individuals across the world, including here in the United States. It is commonly regarded as one of the most pressing human rights issues of our time. Human trafficking affects every community in the United States across age, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic backgrounds. Why does trafficking exist? Human trafficking is a market-driven criminal industry that is based on the principles of supply and demand, like drugs or arms trafficking. Many factors make children and adults vulnerable to human trafficking. However, human trafficking does not exist solely because of many people are vulnerable to exploitation. Instead, human trafficking is fueled by the demand for cheap labor, services, and commercial sex. Human traffickers are those who employ force, fraud, coercion, and victimize others in their desire to profit from the existing demand. To ultimately solve the problem of human trafficking, it is essential to address the demand-driven factors as well as alter the overall market incentives of high profit, low risk that traffickers currently exploit. Labor trafficking and sex trafficking of U.S. citizens and foreign nationals persist and thrive for a number of reasons, including low risk. Human traffickers perceive there to be little risk or deterrence to affect their criminal operations. While investigations, prosecutions, and penalties have increased throughout the years, many traffickers still believe the high profit margin to be worth the risk of detection. Factors that add to low risk include lack of government and law enforcement training, low community awareness, ineffective or unused laws, lack of law enforcement investigations, scarce resource for victim recovery service, or social blaming of victims. High profits. When individuals are willing to buy commercial sex, they create a market and make it profitable for traffickers to sexually exploit children and adults. When consumers are willing to buy goods and services from industries that rely on forced labor, they create a profit incentive for labor traffickers to maximize revenue and minimize production costs. Where do trafficked children come from? Children trafficking victims, whether for labor, sex, or organ trafficking, come from all backgrounds, include both boys and girls. They span from a wide range from 1 to 18 years old. Sex trafficking victims up to roughly 25 years old most often start as young as 14. Children are trafficked out of or into the United States from all regions of the world, represented a variety of different races, ethnic groups, and religions. They may be brought to the United States legally or smuggled in. Trafficked children can be lured to the U.S. through the promise of school or work and promise the opportunity to spend their money back to their families. Children are also vulnerable to kidnappers, pimps, and professional brokers. Some children are even sold to traffickers by their families who may or may not have an understanding of what happened to the child. U.S.-born children are also trafficked within the United States, coming from any racial age group, socioeconomic background, and come from or trafficked within both cities and rural areas. Here are some of the numbers. In 2012, the United States Nation Office on Drug and Crime reports the percentage of victims had risen in a 3-year span from 20% to 27% of every 3 child victims. 2 are girls and 1 is a boy. Gender and age profile of victims detected globally: 59% women, 14% men, 17% girls, and 10% were boys. 6,000 to 8,000 women, children, men bought and sold across international borders every year to exploit for forced labor and commercial sex. When internal trafficking victims are added to the estimates, the number of victims annually is a range of 2 to 4 million. 50% of those victims are estimated to be children. It is estimated that 76% of transactions for sex with underage girls start on the internet. 2 million children are subject to prostitution in global commercial sex trade. There are 20.9 million victims of trafficking worldwide as of 2012. 1.5 million victims in the United States of America. What's the impact? Human trafficking has surpassed the illegal sale of firearms. Trafficking will surpass the legal sale of drugs in the next few years. Drugs are used once and then they are gone. The victims of child trafficking have been used and abused over and over. A $32 billion a year industry, human trafficking is on a rise and is in all 50 states. 4.5 million of trafficked persons are sexually exploited. Up to 300,000 Americans under the age of 18 are lured into commercial sex trade every year. From 14,500 to 17,500 of these victims are trafficked into the United States each year. The physical and mental consequences of trafficking for victims. Child victims of human trafficking face a significant problem. Often physically and sexually abused, they have distinctive medical or psychological needs that must be addressed before advancing in the formative years of adulthood. Child victims of exploitation can be faced a number of long-term health problems. Sleeping and eating disorders, sexually transmitted diseases or infections, HIV and AIDS, pelvic pain, rectum trauma, urinary difficulties from working in the sex industry, drug addiction, chronic back, hearing, cardiovascular, respiratory problems from endless days of tooling in dangerous agriculture, sweatshops, and construction conditions. There's fear, anxiety, depression and mood changes, guilt and shame, culture shock from finding themselves in a strange country, post-traumatic stress disorder, traumatic bonding with the trafficker. Human trafficking punishment. The punishment for human trafficking varies from one state to another, as well as the type of trafficking that is involved. As such, human trafficking on its own carries a sentence of between 3 to 8 years. If the person involved was a minor, a 4-year minimum sentence is required. If rape is involved, Section 264 state penalties of between 3 to 8 years in prison must be imposed. If rape is concerted was involved, Section 246.1 states penalties of between 5 to 9 years in prison must be imposed. If kidnapping was involved, Section 208 demands a minimum sentence of between 3 to 11 years. If a person is kidnapped was under the age of 14, a minimum sentence of 5 years will be imposed. If kidnapping to commit sexual crimes is involved, Section 209 imposed a life imprisonment sentence with a possibility of parole. Human trafficking sentencing guidelines. Sentencing in human trafficking cases is often very difficult. With human trafficking, there are usually a number of aggravating and mitigating factors that must be taken into consideration. If the individual involved is under the age of 18 and if sex trafficking is involved, harsher penalties are usually imposed. Prosecutors are often encouraged to trial these as separate offenses, particularly because the victim's age is a significantly aggravating factor. Other aggravating circumstances that will incur harsher penalties include if the defendant has committed human trafficking crimes in the past, be they prostitution, sex trafficking, labor trafficking, or any other type. If the victim suffered bodily harm during sex trafficking. If the victim was held in sex trafficking situation for more than 180 days. If there was more than one victim involved. If the defendant is a public official.